Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Irvin Duggan, President of the Society of the Four Arts, and we are delighted to welcome you to this gallery talk by our visiting artist. Ever since I've been involved in arts and cultural institutions, I've been fascinated with the blurred lines that exist in this world. For example, what is the difference between opera and mere musical theater? When Porgy and Bess was introduced in the 1930s, it was thought to be musical theater and not very good musical theater. Now, increasingly, it is recognized as a Native American opera, and the Houston Grand Opera, great opera companies in this country, have produced Porgy and Bess as opera. But interesting arguments break out and controversies break out when the lines are blurred. There's a blurred line, for example, between craft and art. And our speaker today has been involved in that controversy because for too long, commentators on his work wanted to consider him a craftsman because surely the carving of birds is craft and not art. But when you see the work, you know that this is more than mere craft. It crosses that blurred line and finds a resting place securely in the world of genuine art. What is art? An interesting thing about this artist and this day is that it enables us to reflect for a few minutes on that perennial question, what is art? Every artist is a craftsman, but not every craftsman is an artist. Art has to do with surpassing skill, with craft that transcends mere craft. It has to do with a kind of emotional insight and impact that when the viewer sees the work, he is struck not only at the intellectual level, but at the emotional level as well, and takes away a lasting sense of encounter, of special experience. Art involves vaulting ambition. Artists are serious about what they do, and they attempt. In the words of Browning, a man's reach should exceed his grasp, else what's a heaven for? That constant grasping is one way that we define true artists. And finally, originality defines true art. By every one of these yardsticks, our speaker today is a genuine artist, and the work that he has done over many years rises to the level of genuine art. We are having with this show a once-in-a-lifetime experience. These works that represent an entire career to date have been assembled from private collections because typically they go from the studio of the artist into private collections and are not seen by the public. So this is a special once-in-a-lifetime experience to see the art and to meet the artist. Imagine having a personal encounter with Audubon. Well, our artist, as I say perhaps too often, is as if Audubon or Mark Catesby came to life in the 21st century and worked in 3 dimensions, a once-in-a-lifetime experience. It is also art that reflects an interesting lifetime. You will see on a shelf in what we call the process room, the recreation, the partial recreation of the artist's studio, a little wooden bird that he carved when he was 13 years old. When he told his mother that he wanted to carve birds, she went and cut a piece of the corner of their house off, a log cabin, and set it in front of him and said, "Carve a bird for me." This work dates from that moment and represents a great life story. After his talk, our visiting artist will sign the catalog, of which we are very proud. We've produced this show and the exhibition catalog ourselves. And it is a most interesting catalog with a beautiful essay by James Kilgo about the life and work of this artist. We recommend that you obtain a copy and take it to be signed by the artist who will be signing works after this, signing the catalog. And you'll have an opportunity to meet this remarkable artist. His name, ladies and gentlemen, Grainger McKoy. Please welcome Grainger McKoy.
Thank you, Irvin. It's one thing I've been reminded of since arriving here, and that's about all of us have a story, especially those from the South. And Irvin has triggered that again, just to scan back and look again at my story. Some of my story is his story because we actually lived probably, 30 miles apart at one point. And that first bird that you will see shortly is of cypress, and it was cut maybe 10 miles from where Irvin grew up. So my story continues, and I want to share some of my story through my work with y'all. So let's begin. This is my mother. If you can read, it's Mother's Day, 1953. She was moving into a log cabin that she and my father were building. In 1953, most people who in log cabins were trying to get out of them. And she and my father were moving their 3 sons into a log cabin. They'd both grown up, and both families, the McKoy's and the Graingers, were from Wilmington. And my father had been transferred to run a small mill supply company in the Sumter area, and they had bought a small piece of ground, and they just wanted to get their 3 sons in the country. And here she is, high heels, necklace. So I was raised in one of those rooms with a lot of wood around me, and a mother who lived outside the box. So I think she was my first encourager, and as you know, we all need encouragement. So 3 years after this picture was taken, my father died of a heart attack. And she stayed in that cabin and raised her 3 sons. She took a job at the local Episcopal church as a secretary for $25 a week. That combined with Social Security, she raised us. I showed interest in drawing and working with my hands, so she would always keep a piece of paper in front of me and a pencil. And my grandmother, her mother, some strange reason, out of the box, gave me a decoy for a birthday present. And I mean, what 12-year-old gets a decoy for a birthday present? But I got one. And that triggered, I said, Mother, I want to carve a bird. And that's when she allowed me to cut one of the ends of that cabin off to carve this bird. And that's of cypress, and that's in the exhibit. And that started my story that you see in the gallery. And I went on, and I was educated in the Sumter County school system. That's Sumter County. That's mid-South Carolina. And part of my story is my dear wife, Floride, who's here, of course, sat in front of me in the 3rd grade. So she was part of my story and has been an early encourager also. Went on to Clemson University thinking I wanted to be an architect. Studied architecture for a number of years, a couple of years, until I worked for an architect one summer and discovered that the practice of architecture and the study of architecture were two different things. And I, not being business inclined and wanting or desiring to go to Rotary clubs and things of that sort, I changed my major to zoology. So that was another leg of the story. Upon graduating from Clemson with a degree, Florida and I, with a small child, moved to Beaufort, worked there. And at that point, right along in there, I met my mentor, another great encourager. His name was Gilbert Maggione. I don't have a picture of Gilbert, but Gilbert became somewhat of a father figure for me. Another encourager. He was the first true artist I'd ever met, yet he was an eccentric. He didn't marry for the first time until he was 63. And he lived that bachelor's life down in Beaufort, on Factory Creek, on Ladies Island, running an oyster cannery. And he painted in his underwear midday. And I mean, it was wild. I love Gilbert. He saw some of my work, and he would encourage me to come visit, and I would spend a weekend with him when I was in high school and went on to college. And upon graduating from college, he said, "Grainger, why don't you just try carving for 6 months? Try for a year. And you try it now. Scratch that itch now. And don't wait. Try it now, because you'll never regret it." And I didn't quite understand what he was talking about, but it sounded plausible to a 21-year-old. So Florrie and I moved to Beaufort. Knowing now, that was very shaky, because Gilbert wasn't making a living carving or anything. We just launched out on that journey, that leg of the journey. But in our travels, Gilbert would because he would exhibit some of his carvings on the East Coast, and I would travel with him. And when we were in New York, he'd take me to the Metropolitan, and he would stand in those spaces and challenge me, "Grainger, what makes this art?" Or we would go to the National Gallery in Washington, and we would go there, and he'd stand in front of a Rembrandt. Or he said, "Grainger, look at this. What makes it art?" And he would say, "Grainger, never think anything but art when you carve." That word carving has a connotation to it that you're in the mountains on a step of a cabin, whittling. He said, "Grainger, think beyond that. Think big. Think art." And he challenged me. He just challenged me. And also he said, "Grainger, be true to the bird. Be true to the bird." Florrie and I, with our 2 children, lived in Beaufort about 18 months or 2 years thereabouts. And Gilbert was he was an Italian and somewhat of a godfather. I mean, he expected and demanded, and I think for my marriage's sake, I needed to move. So we moved to Wadmalaw Island, which is 20 miles south. It's a sea island, about 20 miles south of Charleston. And this was my first studio. I don't know if John Perrell is here this morning, but I see him in the back. I think he met John in Beaufort, moved down there about the same. I think he took this picture. A couple of my children were with my dog, and you can see it was an old converted country store about 25 miles south of Charleston. And I made a lot of sawdust and breathed a lot of sawdust in that space. That was in the early, probably 72. there are two types of encouragers. There are encouragers that I found that will slap you on the back and cheer you on. And then there are encouragers that will reach for the wallet. And South Carolina is full of the former. But there's one South Carolinian who's here, and his name is John Trask, and he was both. And this was a very early piece done in early 70s, 72, 73, I think. And this was the first piece that I'd carved that I inserted the wing feathers, the separate feathers, which was, you know, you're looking at a bird wing, all those feathers were separate. If you pulled a feather out, it was separate. So I started inserting the feathers in each wing, and this was the first one. And I was encouraged when John purchased this. Maybe it was Caroline that purchased this for John's birthday, I'm not sure, but still a great encouragement to me. That led to this piece, which soon followed, just an expansion of insertions, and there were 3 birds, and they saw this piece, and they knew that it was a childhood friend, and they had seen me growing up with my brothers, and since there were 3 of us, he said, "Grainger, that's just you growing up with your brothers." So I kind of like that idea. But one of the challenges of representing birds in flight, and that's what I love to do, is spread that. And this is another, going back to Gilbert Maggione, my mentor, he said, "Grainger, if a bird gives you something, use it. If he has a toe, spread it. If he has a mandible, open it. If he has a wing, spread it." And so he said, it's composition. They give you all you need, and then tell a story. So this is following up on that encouragement. It's just telling a story, spreading a wing. The immature bird is in the center. The 2 adult birds on either ends. Another thing I'd like to call time out now. Usually when I would think of a gallery talk, it's walking through the space and taking questions. So I'm giving y'all permission at any time just to raise your hand, and we can take a little sidebar and do that rather than, and we can address that now if it's not too disruptive. I see a hand. Yes. Both. Everything. Since I'm seeking the truth, I need photographs for wing positions, but when it comes to the feather, it's nothing better than the bird. And I have a freezer full of birds. And another sidebar of that is my children grew up with birds on paper towels in the refrigerator, you know. And that, you know, they just thought that was normal. They would reach across a soil rail on a napkin reaching for the milk, and their friends would come. And I didn't know it until later. They would go home and explain. They said, "Mom or Dad, they got dead birds in the refrigerator." And didn't know if they would allow their friends to come back to visit, but it was just normal. Yes. We will get great question, and the question is about suspension, and I think a little later on in this, we will address that with the steel and the metal running through. You will notice in the exhibit there are a number of sketches, but these sketches were just very just to get an idea down. They never were actually intended to be exhibited, because if they were, I probably couldn't sketch. You know, I would freeze up. But I think I sketched this one while my wife was in the grocery store, and I was sitting out in the car waiting for her, and just on the back of a paper bag. But this was just an idea of 2 hawks and a snake. But it's another thing about telling a story is I'm always looking for a reason to suspend birds, get a bird up, spread his wing, any way I can do that. And then, too, in nature, there's that story of prey-predator relationships, and young birds and old birds, immature and mature birds. So this sculpture was a result of that. I had observed a mature bird, a mature hawk, making a kill, and the teenager sometimes would follow the adult around and come in and blunder into that circumstance, and this is a result of that. It's just an immature bird, which is a little bird, and the adult bird up. Just telling a story. This copperhead snake, I looked up and read about a copperhead, and the record was in Florida at 52 inches, so I made this one 53. I figured it must be. But this is not quite true, because a copperhead does not have a prehensile tail, meaning it could grab, but I had to, I stretched it a little bit. But those stories, that goes in my family. Can't help it. Stretching it a little bit. This is another early piece that, another thing that always appealed to me is flocks, numbers of birds together, flocks of birds. And that allowed me, again, to suspend birds, get them up in the air. Again, metal runs through these pieces, and you will see an example of that later on in this presentation. But the lower piece of grass, Spartana grass, which that would be, was made from a Model A car spring. I didn't know anything about heat treating at that time, and I knew that spring steel could be used. So that lower reed is from an old Model A, and then I worked up from there. This was an early piece that was sold through Hammer Galleries in New York, and Dan Lufkin owns this piece. But this was a piece that I've just pushed the limit. You can see under the wing how so many inserted feathers. I was interested in the different feather regions, the underwing coverts, and you got your primary feathers and secondary feathers. All birds have 10 primary feathers, and then when you get into secondaries, they would change, and then you have all these feather combinations which intrigue me. And I will try to use this just briefly, but to show an example. See, these feathers right here are the axillary feathers, and these feathers right here are the underwing coverts. And those things intrigued me about the biology of the wing. So this was an example of just pushing that limit, pushing it in wood as far as I could go. And so this was an early example of that. Again, a quick sketch of two clapper rails with a fiddler crab. Again, telling a story, prey-predator relationships, and the possibilities of combining two birds. Maybe there just wasn't enough fiddler crabs to go around that day. So it just allowed me to spread a wing and to try to create something that could be viewed from all sides. Another thing that always trying to be true to the bird. You see the outside toe has 4 joints, the middle toe has 2, and the inside toe has 1 joint. Things of that sort interest me, just to be correct on. A lot of times people say, Grainger, I can't believe it's wood. And certainly that's a compliment. I like that. But then again, I want to somehow say that it's wood. It comes from a material that I love. So this was one that I just left incomplete, showing the wood, the material, and the finished bird, and still trying to represent the bird accurately, showing the wood and the textured surfaces too, trying to just stretch my wings. I was always stretching my wings, trying to. I've always enjoyed the simplicity of pen and ink. And I was walking on the beach one day up on the Outer Banks, and I came upon a dead plover in the sand, and the wind had washed up over it, the sand up over it, and I just wanted capture that. So that's in the exhibit, and so that's just another trying to represent what I've seen and what I felt in this piece. So I just left it unpainted. It's the texturing's done with a hot pen. So just left it in its raw form, thinking that might be the best way to represent my feeling at the moment. This is starting to answer a question about support. So there's a covey rise that you will see shortly, but this is just starting to figure, it's a sketch of trying to figure out how I will support one bird to another. And then you can see there's a socket thought idea, how they are going to be set, because I always have to think about shipping, how these things are going to be shipped and reassembled and assembled again. So this is just an idea, a quick sketch of how that might occur, and you see the metal slowly, the sketch of that. And then this is the piece in process, and you can see the darker areas of the metal running through the birds. And then I will cover those metal, that steel, with other feathers. So, and then the final thing is to paint them, of course. But can y'all see how that metal runs through the birds? And a lot of times that's what takes so long, is trying to figure, because all that is hidden in the final piece. It's just the structure that holds it together a lot of times is the most time consuming. And this is what you this is the piece out there, and all the upper birds all disassemble. The primary feathers a high carbon steel. I have a machine gun factory not far from me, and they specialize, of course, and when you're making machine guns, they have to have a heat treating process for different parts of those guns. And I know one of the managers there, and whenever I need metal treated, made into spring steel, so to speak, I will take these finished parts to them before I will assemble the bird, and they will run them through their heat treating furnaces and allow me to. These things will shake and wave, because what you don't want with a high, with untreated steel, these things would snap and possibly break. So this is my first piece that I was sitting on the dock on the North Edisto River one day, and it was a gray fog. The fog was just beginning to lift, but the sun hadn't broken through yet, and the water was so smooth and calm in the water and in the cloud. It was just one gray canvas out there. And this skimmer came skimming by, and all I saw were two birds. So that triggered this sculpture here. I saw two birds, and I didn't see any water in that process. So that was just trying to capture that in some way. The lower mandible on these birds are steel, so that's what supports this, and the upper bird separates. I love walnut, so that's why I chose that. Of course, this is a quick sketch. I think somebody had brought me a recently, how do you say it, dead skimmer. And I just tried to capture the colors from it, because those colors would soon fade. And so this was just one of those sketches to try to capture that for later use. This is a piece, again, always trying to stretch the limit a little bit, is you see, of course, one wing is missing, but how I tried to represent that wing is in the leaves. And a friend of mine came by, and he looked at that, and he shook his head and said, "Grainger, you've been sniffing. You got too close to the glue pot on that one." So, but anyway, it was just, again, some things work and some don't. You will actually, when that's lit in the gallery area, you can see that shadow on the wall behind the piece. So, and this was one of the first pieces that started to incorporate maybe this is some of my architecture background, and this is started to incorporate the case in the overall design of the sculpture. So course, the case here is required to hold the bird up, trying to separate from the water surface. Again, after I do a quick sketch, what I would do very quickly then thereafter is, I've never been satisfied with just 2 dimensions. I want to get it in 3 dimensions as quick as I can. So this would just be a quick wood model. You may see it on the shelf. It might be 6 inches high, of an idea of a flight of sanderlings. And this would be the finished product. But I work out a lot of the supporting elements, work out the design in that. And just, again, not thinking the wave was that important, trying to make something disappear there and concentrate on the birds. So that's where the walnut idea of wave, just a different way of seeing. That's what I've discovered. One thing about art is, in my pursuit and prodding around, is it's just a process of learning to see. And I've just been blessed in being allowed to see things and be paid for them. Yes, let's see. Good question. There's this wave, it's a piece of steel running, if my hand won't shake, so let's see how this thing works. Right here, there's a piece of steel running through this wing, and there's a socket here that was removed, and so this is shipped separately, and each bird is separated. There's a piece of steel that runs here all the way through. Those wings are all parts of them are steel, and they're continual right on through. If that helps with the question. Yes. Yes, sir. It's a male-female socket right here that this lifts out of, and that socket is secured through the fabric. Yes. Well, part of the question is, how do I get the bird to stay on the steel? And there are sockets, and I tell you what I will do after this. I will go in and I will take one of these birds apart. Anybody who's interested in seeing how that works, it's best shown than told. So I'll be glad to show that in the gallery after this time, if that would help. Again, working on a reflection idea, watching a least bittern, looking down, there's a reflection, and it's in the gallery. A man in Connecticut, a stockbroker in Connecticut, commissioned me to do a piece, and I told him, I sent him a sketch, and he called me up, and he said, "Grainger, I don't understand what you're trying to do here, but I trust you." Oh, Lord, when somebody says that, he will really challenge you, and you will do your extra level best to try to please somebody who trusts you but doesn't know. So this was that piece, and it was interesting. I took it up to Connecticut, and I put it in his house, and he sat down and he started crying, and I didn't know what that meant, as where's your, uh-oh. But it was because he did like it. Another example of a case being incorporated into the overall sculpture. Ringneck ducks fly in open water, and trying to, again, this will be echoed again in other sculptures, but showing the wing of the lower bird maybe representing speed by attaching it to the sculpture in some way, rather than having a leaf or of that sort. Just, again, going back to my mentor, Maggione, Grainger Think Art, and that echoes and it in my ears, and I say, okay, let's try this. That's where that. This is the 5 pintails, and me. Here I am in the process with it, and you can see in this piece right there. You see the metal wing feathers right here, and they slowly emerge in, and it comes through the birds. And these are metal here, and this is a metal tail feather, and these are birds. The metal has already been completed here. Now I'm just wrapping the birds and finishing the birds around them. And this would be the finished piece that y'all have seen in the gallery. Another sketch of just some parakeets. I've always been intrigued about the Carolina parakeet. One, a beautiful bird, and I was reading in a publication in the early 1800s where Alexander Wilson was on the Ohio River. I had no idea that the Carolina parakeet extended that far north, but he was on the Ohio River in a blinding snowstorm. And he said he saw a flight of Carolina parakeets flying down the river like pigeons in full cry. And I imagined, what a sight that must have been in the snow with these beautiful birds flying about. That's where this stone idea came here, is just acknowledging the snow in Alexander Wilson's comment. So anyway, that's the Carolina parakeet. Again, another study of a covey rise, quail rising, with the finished piece here. This is owned by Mr. Phipps here on Palm Beach. Again, another idea of just study, how I will go about just working out ideas and sketches, and you can see I couldn't even wait. I had to even start putting a 3-dimensional piece in this idea, in this sketch. And this is a result. Another thing about my work is, of course, this is part of the story. I put a wood duck in a croaker sack, and I hung it on my back porch, and I went in and ate supper, and when I came out, the croaker sack wasn't as strong as I thought it was, and it had partially crawled out of that sack. So that was just a memory, trying to make just the wood sack is a tupelo, which is of course a southern wood, and of course the other bird, the bird is of basswood, and basswood grows above 2,000 feet. It's up in the Appalachia. It's a wonderful wood. You're familiar with it because cheese used to come in dry cooperage. And that would be basswood, because basswood has very little resin to affect the taste of the cheese. But basswood is very stable, but it's a hard wood, but it's very easily carved. There's not much differentiation between the spring and the summer wood. So when you look at an end piece of basswood, it looks very uniform. It's because it has very little resin in it. It's not a very good building material for outside building, because water is absorbed and it breaks. It has no resin and it's protected. So it was used. A lot of it was used in furniture making, for furniture backing, the back of drawers and things of that, where it was very stable. But so it's been a wonderful wood. It's my favorite, and the best basswood I've found comes from New Hampshire, so I get the same. It's the same as the southern. For some reason, it grows differently up there, and it has a sweeter smell. This is a southern saying, but it is a sweet wood in New Hampshire. A sketch of the Lawrences down in below Thomasville, above Tallahassee, have a home on Lake Nicosuke, and they wanted me to. They have a love for ringneck ducks, and they wanted me to do a flight coming down their wall, and you can see that they are in the exhibit, but not in this wing position. I mean, in this flight position, because the ceiling wasn't tall enough, so we represent them a little bit different. But this was a model that I would have that I created for them to imagine what the final piece would look like. Again, I guess that's where my architectural training has come in handy. And I love it. You can eliminate a lot of problems by working. The more you think ahead of time, and it's worked for me, a good process to make models. I started moving into bronze some. Working with supporting birds in steel, and I've started working with metal, as you can see in the past, and I said, well, how about if the whole bird was metal? And then it wouldn't require glass and all this protection. So I carved a small wren and molded it and cast, and this was, and the significance of the lock is that this lock was one, again, back to story. This lock, my mother had an old lock very similar to this on the front door of our cabin, and you could pick it with a stick, but she kept the key up by a little lantern, and in the spring, in early spring and summer, we would come home, and a wren always made its nest on that key, was making one, and it always fussed at us when we disturbed it, reaching for that key. So this was just that story. These mourning doves are bronze. Again, I've begun painting some of the bronze because of the detail that I'm able to achieve in the casting, that I think at times they beg for pigment, and they get it. Yes, ma'am. Great question, and whether I carve in clay or wood. And great question, because I was taking my wooden birds to these foundries, and they would shake their head and say, no, we can't do that. Work in clay and come back. Because the foundries want to cast from clay and make the molds from clay. And I said, I don't work in clay. I work in wood. And they said, well, work in clay. They didn't want to really bother with that. And then, because there's the art foundry casting, they all work from clay. So I was in my dentist, I was having my tooth cleaned, the teeth, whatever, one day, and you know how I was having a root canal or something, I don't know what, you know how they put this rubber stuff around your tooth, and it comes off, and 2 weeks later that tooth fits? Isn't that amazing? I mean, it really fits. And I asked my dentist if I could put some of that silicone around a feather. He said, sure. And that's where the light went off. So what I discovered is I went in the direction of the dental jewelry technology rather than the art casting. It's done in a vacuum. All the casting and high detail is achieved in a vacuum casting process, which allows just extreme high detail to come through that. So if that helps with the vacuum casting, jewelry and real fine castings are done under a vacuum. It is lost wax. It's just that the metal is drawn into the space. And again, there's so many metaphors. Again, if I can take a sidebar in this, there's so many metaphors that I've discovered over the years, because I spend all my time by myself. That's how I work, is by myself, and just pondering and thinking. But the metaphor here is that to achieve real high detail, the metal has to be drawn into the space to fill that real small space. Because if you depended on gravity, it would only go so far into the space, and there's hot air and gas there that says, no, don't fill me up anymore. So you have to remove all this hot air and gas in the space in which you're pouring it for the metal to be sucked in and achieve a full casting. That might be a little complicated, but anyway, that's what the vacuum does. It pulls all the obstacles in front of the metal pouring for it to achieve the detail that you're looking for. And I look at that in my own life sometimes. What is the hot air and gas in my life that keeps the detail from being, so, you know, it's just, I love those little metaphors that can occur. This was one done in sterling, and it's in Exodus 16, it talks about Moses. You know how the quail, if y'all are familiar with the quail coming into the camp. And, of course, most people know about the manna. In the morning, the Israelites were given manna. But in the evening, quail came into the camp. And I envisioned Moses going out and catching the first quail. So Moses' hand here just happened to look like mine because that's the only one I had to go in. But it's an idea to work in sterling. And it's a wonderful metal to pour, and it responds wonderfully to vacuum casting. Again, a Carolina parakeet, painted bronze. For some reason, I just trying to be true to the front edge of the bird, not worrying about, I guess because maybe it's extinct, I just left part of it undone to represent that. But here's a sterling recovery stroke, and it's the same thing, the same wing that's in the center of the gal rat here. And I've always been intrigued, birds, when they fly, they have a power stroke, and then they have the recovery stroke, and they have a power stroke and a recovery stroke. And I've always been intrigued in photography of that recovery stroke because the primary is twist, and it's in its recovery, yet it's the weakest wing position a bird can be in, because if you're being pursued, you want your wing to always be in a power stroke, believe me. If a shark's after you, you don't want your arm here, you want it here. You don't want to be in the power stroke. That's why a propeller works so well. It's always in the power stroke. But the recovery stroke had a certain grace and beauty to it that always attracted me. And when the Hollins Cancer Center approached me about doing a sculpture for their lobby, prey-predator relationships or something didn't really work well in a cancer center with. So I just pursued this theme with them, which they really appreciated, and we decided upon doing the recovery stroke with the grace and beauty in recovery. And all of us, quite frankly, all of us are in recovery somewhere in our lives, whether physically or emotionally, relationally, all of us. So we can always relate to that. I think all of us can to some degree. And there's a verse in the Bible, in Corinthians, it states, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And that verse just doesn't seem to, you have power and weakness and grace and sufficient, and it's a trigger for a lot of many conversations with people about recovery, and which I enjoy. I love to see people recovering, because all of us basically are. On occasion, I visit the local county jail, and I go in, and it's wonderful after those visits and months later to go and get your oil changed, and somebody comes out from underneath a car and shakes my hand, thank me for visiting them, and just to say hello. And here's a person in recovery, and that's been extremely meaningful for me. A wing disassembled, many parts, reassembled. This was one that was molded. Each piece was molded and cast and reassembled for that recovery stroke. Here it is again in its larger form prior to molding. And this is the gamecock. I come from Sumter County. Thomas Sumter was a famous Revolutionary War general in our area. Our county's named after him. The British named him the Gamecock because he had such a tenacious spirit. He was just he fought to the end. They could never capture him, so that's where this sculpture came. The county commissioned me to sculpt this for them. Yes.
When you
oil primarily. Sometimes the underpaintings will be acrylic. A lot depends on the color that I'm achieving. If it's a very light color, I will undercoat it with an acrylic to cover the brown and then overpaint with that. But if it's a brown or umbers or ochres or you see the black here, sometimes I will use ink. Ink is wonderful for these darker colors. It's absorbed right into the wood, and so many different, yes? Paint on metal is a great question. People ask me that because they're concerned about paint on metal, and I use a primer. And I have to remind them when they go by used car lots, there's a lot of cars out there with a lot of paint still on them for years and years. And metal, paint does work on metal, but I use a metal primer specifically, and I will slightly sandblast the surface of the metal to put a small amount of bite in it. So when that metal paint is sprayed on, it will adhere. This is a Cooper's hawk, an immature Cooper's hawk flushing a covey of quail. Another prey-predator relationship, including the case. And this was a model I made for the space in which it was going. This is a wildfire plantation outside of Albany, Georgia, and Albany, and Joe Davenport's place. And this is the final piece of that. Again, incorporating the case into that. What I did not mention is most of these covey rises I do happen in a certain time of year. This, again, of course, Thanksgiving, I think of quail shooting and Thanksgiving going together. So at that time of year, a certain number of birds will be birds of the previous year. Some birds will be less than 150 days old. Some will be greater than 50 days old. So there are different molting processes. If you are a biologist and you know those, you'll be able to pick out those birds. So that makes it even more interesting in my sculpting, is to be true to that element of the sculpture also. Again, that's just a quick picture. This is just all those feathers of a sculpture laid out being painted. See, all the feathers have to be, I paint them prior to assemblage. So just keeping track of all these feathers. You just don't want to sneeze in there. So, many feathers. This is a more recent piece. Again, reflection rather than using wood. This was the little bird is bronze of a common tern with a silver side minnow. Just again trying to elevate, create. This another quick sketch of the three mallards getting up, and you can see in this left-hand corner working out some of the metal supporting elements. I make a full-scale model before I start on things, just to get the scale and position right, and then I start putting the birds together. And you can see this answers some of the question of working the steel through these pieces. You see, this is steel runs through the whole piece. You see. And then the bird is then constructed around. There's that steel running through there, and the bird's body is, and this is the belly of the bird getting ready to be placed on, covering the steel. And of course, right up here is this as a close-up of that. Is the, you can see right here how these two would separate right here, and that would have been worked out right in my sketch right here. You see how I was working out that idea? Again, right here, you see. So just, it's a lot of trial and error, but that's something you won't see in the sculpture. And there's the finished piece. That piece, I think, was about 18 months. And the corn stalks are all bronze, cast in bronze. But it's the metal work, it's the supporting elements, really, that takes so long doing. And that's true in our own lives. Sometimes things are unseen to make us that support us are the ones that take the longest. This is the more recent piece, the ivory-bill woodpecker. I finished around this past Thanksgiving. Quick sketch. These birds were birds that are at the Charleston Museum. And of course, my son went down and photographed these birds with me, and we put them on a grid, and there are many photographs made, so I was able to scale these birds out to be accurate. And the final piece. And the limb, the pine limb at the base is cast in bronze. There are two primary feathers that are in steel. And this I think Tom Sterling, who had visited my shop a number of times, I think he's here, but he's come by, and part of the running video in there shows this bird in process. I'd just like to end this with just talking about briefly, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. We've been talking about relationships, and it's very easy for me to have a relationship with a piece of wood because I can retreat into my shop. I have complete control over it, and I can sit there and ponder. The more difficult relationships are with people, as y'all can all know. And as I grow older, I'm starting to try to pay more attention to those type of relationships. I know that when I am on my deathbed, and I won't be telling my wife, Floride, please go get my pocket knife. I want to just carve one more bird. That won't be on my lips, I know. What I will be reaching for is not my pocket knife, but I'll be reaching for a hand. And if that's going to be true then, my goal is to pay more attention to that now. So that's still part of my story, is I love wood, and I love relationship with wood. But my relationships are slowly changing as I grow old. What I've discovered is, over the years, by carving a feather, a single feather, in my younger days, I thought I could outdo God, possibly. I was going to at least measure up to him or something. But that single feather has humbled me because I can't do it. It's pushed me into, I guess, in being humbled by the truth, which these birds are. All I do is copy the bird. I'm a plagiarizer. But believe me, the better I plagiarize, the better living I make. But in that whole process, I'm reminded and I'm humbled, and I'm able to give more thanks for our surroundings, for my relationships. And you know something, you talk about the hidden metal running through us. All of us are supported somehow by something. And so much of my support is hidden, and that's my family and my friends who have come down here. And there are a lot of hidden supports in my life, and I just give thanks for those. And I give thanks for y'all who've come this Saturday morning, to spend time in this auditorium with my family and with me. So thank you all. And I will, any other questions, I think we've probably spent enough time in here, I will answer later. So thank you.